Yo everyone, how are you doing? How is or was your Halloween? I hope you had a fun time spooking around, trick-or-treating, maybe even a TTRPG spooky one-shot? Maybe? I did in fact have one. This episode goes live after I've had played a Halloween game. Okay, enough with my fun time. Let's dive into the announcements for you guys. First, Why Your World Matters 2 is done with the final quality control and will probably appear the 10th of November as a podcast episode. Yes, it's coming again. Woo! Second of all, I have listened to Doomed to Repeat Arc 2 Episode 1 2 times already and it's amazing. You guys should definitely check it out. There will be a link in the description right to the episode for you to listen in. Also listen to Arc 1 if you haven't. If you do not know what that is, you should stick around until Sergio talks about it. It's his campaign for Mayday Roleplay. I mean, holy shit, that one moment with downtime? Damn. Okay. Moving on, the title of this episode is What You Can Expect, a discussion about horror. Some people might not find this suitable for themselves or their kids, and listener discretion is advised just to be safe. It shouldn't be any severe things, but stay safe, right? Stay safe. With that, there's only one thing left for me to do, and that is ask you to give us a nice review on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you want to book ad slots, just hook us up on Twitter. They're actually very cheap. Okay, and now I will give off to past me, Emil, and past Niels with the recap. Have fun!
And with that, hello and welcome to episode 39 of DoubleDM podcast. With me, as usual, is Emil. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty fine.
Pretty fine doesn't seem... Is there anything specific that changes the mood from fine to pretty fine?
Well, when you've had no real sport for over nearly 2 years, and then have that sport, that's gonna cause some pain in the day after that.
That's gonna fuck you up, definitely.
I've had my first kendo lesson since February 2020. No,
yeah,
it was fun. Like, I love it. I love kendo. I love the people I'm doing it with, but it was a pain in the ass doing it for the first time again. One of the things is, right, everyone is a little bit out of it, right? The more experienced people than me have had it for like 2 or 3 weeks already, so they are a little bit back in it, right? But I am there, and and some other people aren't really in there like I am, and we sit there, and then we are supposed to train, and since we are more or less the advanced class of that course, we get the armor, right? We get the men, we get the do, we get the kote, and then we have to fight or at least spar with each other. And let's say if you're not perfectly in kendo and not have the whole movements memorized, have everything right in your head and in your muscles, you don't hit correctly. Like, I didn't hit correctly often enough, and pained me that I didn't hit as often as I wanted to. But some other people have that same. The problem is, if you're the one being hit and someone hits wrong, you get hurt.
Yeah.
And one person basically hit way above the jaw, the torso area, and hit my ribs. There's no protection on the ribs because the ribs protect you, but it hurts like hell. And it's like, it's this very sharp, lingering...
Yeah.
Right? Because we are so fast with these shinais, with the swords, it really feels like you're like... right? It's not like you're being hit with a massive force, but rather with something like a whip.
Yeah.
It pains you for the next 2 days or something, and I'm sitting here, right? My whole right side is
Yeah. I feel that. I can feel with you exactly. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's just, and the pain, it lingers for multiple days after it and during the whole training. It's just, constantly there, constantly annoying you.
What I did love though is that we've had so many people sign up for this, and we had like the person overviewing the sports equipment and all that, like right, the advisor and all that. Not my sensei, but the advisor of all that, of the whole complex for sports. Basically said that there were so many people that for every course he is like, there seems to be a very big need for sport right now for people. Very many people want to do sports right now.
I mean, for most of them, it has been nearly 2 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is a need in their brain to do
the sports
something.
program of my university where I sign up for this already has been going for the last 6 months, but no, all the martial classes have been given the go as well, right? Because when you do kendo, you are in armor in front of each other, screaming at each other.
Yeah.
You're up close, and you're doing that with everyone, like 40 different people in like the span of 2 or 3 hours. That's not really good if you're in a global pandemic, so they needed to make sure that everything is correctly. And
it's the case for most of the martial classes in general, because you're really up close and
Kendo is a high contact sport, even though we don't touch each other with our hands, but with swords. And
but in any kind of fighting sport, martial arts sport, you are up close and personal with someone.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if you use your hands, swords, or clubs, or whatever kind of sport or martial sport you do, you are just right in front of each other, screaming, breathing. I don't want to say lick each other, but this may happen depending on the sport.
This is my secret attack.
I licked it, now it's mine.
I mean, imagine 2 people like MMA fighting and one just walks up and licks the other person. Like, that's a distraction. That's like stun the enemy with. They are so baffled, and then you just boom. Hit them
it creates openings. I would be confused by this move. Not gonna lie.
When I go into range for licking, I just get hit in the. I just get hit. In Canada, that's not a good idea, I can tell you that.
In general, it is not. Please don't go around licking other people. Please
don't.
Especially
in a pandemic.
Especially in a pandemic, and only do it if you have consent for that. Don't just go around and lick random people.
Don't lick without consent.
Oh man. This is something I needed this week.
Yeah, same. Okay. Did anything happen TTRPG related for you?
Yeah, I had a session on Sunday.
Oh,
with some friends, in-person session, all vaccinated and stuff. You know the drill. We don't have to constantly remind you that we are in favor of everything we need to do, like vaccinations, tests, blah blah blah. But nonetheless, we all did that and had a lot of fun during our in-person session. They were tasked to track the camp of the bandit captain that raided the village they started in. And they did that, but found out that the bandit camp was completely dead. And there was just some necrophages attracted from the bodies. And there was one creature in a mantle or some sort of robed figure without a face, drawn to that camp through the bandit captain, because in his days as a soldier, he looked into the void and got mad, and this then in turn attracted this faceless void creature. This one wiped out all of the bandits in the camp. And yeah, they found a clue leading to one of the backstories of one of the players, which then I hope will blossom into some sort of next character arc happening soon in some sort of demonish cult circus setting kind of thing, where they have to find out some information for the circus, because one of the players is part of that, and with this transforming a college of valor bard into a college of lore bard, so a subclass switch basically. And yeah, I'm excited for that. We had a new player, and you played TTRPGs and D&D for the first time ever. And he was one of the most role-play intensive people at the table.
Yeah, interesting.
And it was a lot of fun. And anything for you, TTRPG related?
Nope, I'm still, like, this episode comes out on Halloween, but that's when I will be having a session. But until then, I have nothing.
Alrighty.
Still in prep of that session, but I can talk about the session because my players came back from a from a ghost temple and now are back in town and investigating the clues they found there. Right, they've met with 2 people already. We'll meet with a third and a 4th person. I have 4 players. Each of these 4 players will bring 1 ghost into the city. 4 people. The 4 people they talk to will go missing. Will be possessed by demonic ghosts, trying to summon a demon in the city at the next full moon. And that's 4 days from the day they are in right now. And they will basically go to this alchemist. They will give him some sort of liquid. The alchemist will do with this liquid, then will be possessed by the ghost. Players will investigate. Players will meet an inspector. Then the arcanist they talk to for magic items crafting and all that stuff, that's what they are called in my setting, will go missing. Then a demonologist with the crystallized demon shard they want to summon goes missing. And then the inspector himself goes missing.
Ooh.
And players will basically have to find the clues before the demon summoning is through or fight a demon.
Nice. Have you decided on a type of demon?
Oh no, I still haven't decided on stat blocks and anything, right? I still need to make the map for the abandoned harbor house they will fight in probably in the end. Or where these demon-possessed or demon ghost-possessed people are hiding. And I will still need to have to make stat blocks for them. And I want to do it a little bit like in a horror setting, right? The players will probably, I at least expect them to spend a night in the academy or something where those demon-possessed people all are themselves, because I think that after like 2 people going missing that they've talked to in the last 2 days, they will expect the 3rd to go missing as well.
Yeah.
And then they will realize that there are 2 demonic possessed half-demon people, right? There is a lot to it going around, and then they have to decide maybe if they want to try to cure them, if they kill them, or whatever. And that will basically lead into the next big story of the campaign of this demonic ghost possession thing. The temple, right, belongs to an old civilization of demonic people, and those are trying to get back to reality because they can't die. Their souls get trapped somewhere and then get released into the next body that's born or into the next simple snake. They can possess animals. That's what my players already know. And they already know that they also try to possess people, and this is the first time of it working. And then my players will hopefully get some information as well as to where they have to go next to chase this certain story or because someone has reactivated the souls that have been dormant for over 5,000 or 6,000 years or something.
Yeah.
Someone has reactivated them, and so they need to find that person because they seem to be the one person that wants the return of the glorious race of UNT, because the UNT in my setting are demon snakes.
Nice. One thing I just thought of that might be an interesting task for your players is that 2 or 3 of the characters the players interacted with go missing. That for me kind of means that they will or can draw a lot of suspicion towards them from the city guard, for example.
Yeah, obviously.
That's something
the thing is, the first scene that they will basically go through is talking to this alchemist. That, right, the next planned thing is that this alchemist goes missing. And then an inspector will come, right? And the inspector will probably want to know who this alchemist talked to in the last few days. And the players will be there, right? Because they are supposed to be meeting with this alchemist. So they will be there depending on what they say, what they tell this inspector, right? This inspector will make decisions, maybe planning against them, right? But I also want my players to be part of this investigation, so I still have to make it a little bit, right? And they should be invested because their stuff goes missing with them, right? The liquid goes missing, the demon shard goes missing, and all of that stuff goes missing. And that's basically player property just in the hands of these academics, and they go missing as well. And that's how I think I will invest my players enough in solving this mystery themselves or with this inspector, depending on how they interact with that inspector, right? Are they hostile towards him, like, this is our job, not yours, go away? Well, then the inspector will just probably also think that they might be the perpetrators.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking.
It all depends on the interaction.
It all depends on the first impression the players make. They want to make. They have the decision.
I mean, first impressions matter,
Yeah.
obviously, especially in this situation. Yeah, nice. So, shall we get into...
Yeah. Let's meet Sergio and talk about horror.
Nice.
Hello, everyone. I am Oliver Redboots. I am one of the co-hosts of Rod and Flagon. And would you like to not die? Is not dying out there adventuring around the realms kind of on your higher priority list?
Not dying is underrated. I don't know if you've tried it. I imagine you have tried it, but not dying is good.
10 of 10 would recommend.
Yes.
So if not dying is on your radar, and you would also like to adventure, and you'd like to maybe learn a thing or two about the adventuring lifestyle, where to go,
How to stay alive,
learn about monsters,
learn how not to die,
find out other funny ways that adventurers have died,
while still staying alive,
learn what is valuable loot and what is not valuable loot,
that you can use while you're alive,
and all sorts of other things, come on and over and listen to Rod and Flagon. We will we'll do our best to make sure that you hit the road well prepared to, well, what Swan said.
to not die.
So listen to us every week, Rod and Flagon, everywhere you get your rodcasts. Thank you very much.
As a reminder, don't die.
The Contract is a tabletop role-playing game about ambitious people who go on deadly missions for fantastic powers. With a focus on outside-the-box problem-solving, rotating game masters and self-contained missions, The Contract is a game master boot camp. Hop on the Discord anytime and GM for players who are ready to risk the lives of their beloved characters. The Contract is available 100% for free online with a link in the description. Drop-in friendly, no-commitment sessions are run daily in the Discord.
So, and with that, welcome back to the show. With us now is our guest, Sergio. Would you like to introduce yourself? Who are you? How did you get into TTRPGs? All that stuff.
Hey guys, my name is Sergio. Thanks for having me on. I am a part-time DM, part-time player on the show, or on the group Mayday Roleplay. We stream on Twitch and we have a podcast. I got into TTRPGs kind of late in my life, actually. It wasn't until my 30s. I was living with a girlfriend, and she said, "Have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons?" And amazingly, up to that point, I had not. So she introduced me and showed me, and had a friend run a game for us, and I just immediately fell in love with the genre of gaming, the tabletop games, and have been obsessively playing and finding ways to spread the news about tabletop gaming ever since.
Very nice. And where can people already find you? Where are you from? Why do we have the mysterious figure Sergio on our show today?
Well, I mean, I think you probably have me on because Mayday Roleplay streams on Twitch. On our channel, if you just look up Mayday Roleplay, we have, wherever you get your podcasts, if you look up Mayday Roleplay, we have a D&D campaign called Ashoka, and we have a more modern game called Delta Green that we also have a podcast format of. We have the first arc has been released, and probably by the time this episode comes out, our second arc will be coming out. So we're excited about that.
And now, long-time listeners of the show probably know Eli, who was on episode 9 for Ambience and Music, who was also from Mayday Roleplay, which is where I became a big fan of Mayday Roleplay. Because, to be fair, before that, I have never ever heard of you guys. And then Eli came on, and I was basically so fascinated with the knowledge she had about music and ambient sounds that I checked out your stuff and found this very interesting first episode, or session 0, episode 0 of Doomed to Repeat as basically the first thing on that podcast. And yeah, that is your campaign.
yeah, I am the they call it the handler, not the dungeon master in Delta Green. So I'm the handler for that campaign, and that was our first campaign that we recorded, and I mean, I'm very happy about it because I think that it came out way better than I ever thought it could. The players are amazing in it, and I think we managed to have a lot of fun, and it seems like the Delta Green community, which is very tight-knit and close online, they're very fond of it too, so we're happy about that.
One question though, why Delta Green? How did you find that system? Why did you choose it? What made it so appealing for that?
So I mentioned that I was super into D&D and played it a lot, and at a certain point, actually right before the pandemic, I started getting that itch of, well, what else is out there? You know, I'm a big fan of all kinds of other genres of stuff. So I was thinking, oh, maybe I can try Starfinder, maybe I can try, you know, just different styles of tabletop games. And I'm the kind of guy that when I hear something is award winning and very highly rated, I kind of gravitate towards it out of curiosity. And Delta Green has won a whole bunch of ENnie awards. I don't know exactly what the ENnies. I assume they're just mostly tabletop game focused, but won a bunch of awards, and I liked the aesthetic of the modern person who's usually like a government official trying to cover up and fight back the horrors of the world. When I learned that it was very much inspired by H.P. Lovecraft lore, I also thought that was really cool. And the main reason I think we jumped into it was we had all just kind of met right before the quarantine, and we were playing one-shots online. This is Mayday Roleplay, I mean. And I said, hey guys, I discovered this new game called Delta Green. Let me run it for you. And we did a one-shot that turned into a 2 or 3 session game, but the players really reacted positively to it. And I noticed that they were able to get into character, and they understood because it was a modern setting. It was easy to just be an agent as opposed to being an orc in you know, some kind of fantasy world. It was just very easy to get into it, and they really reacted positively to the horror in the sense that they reacted at all. You know, sometimes as a DM you worry, oh god, are my players just going to stare at me blankly as I unleash this horror on them? But they really reacted the way you need to for a show. And so I thought, okay, we've got something special here. We should try to make this our first campaign.
Mm-hmm. I can definitely see why Delta Green gives you that that very easy finding into the setting. Because I remember from session 0 or episode 0 of your podcast where you were introducing all the agents, and I don't remember the name of the agent or which player played it, but I think the NPC wife of that character came back and said there was no toilet paper anymore. And while we are still in the pandemic, right, that is still something everyone also in the audience can basically relate to. It's very easy to... That was a very easy joke to tell as a handler for you. And it perfectly made clear that this is basically the normal world, but there is the certain extra side that the agents have to deal with.
Sure. And you know, Delta Green obviously did not foresee the pandemic occurring, so we kind of debated back and forth. Do we set it before? Do we set it after? And I thought, you know what? It would be an interesting wrinkle if it was in the middle of the pandemic. I think the justification for the actual mission that the players have, that the agents have, also kind of lends itself to what was happening or what is happening in that time. But a big part of Delta Green is, can you get away with the cover-up? So, you know, you shoot somebody, well, the cops might hear, and other complications beyond the horrific or the supernatural might occur. And so I thought, okay, this is an interesting wrinkle. Not only do they have to cover up, but they also have to try to not catch COVID or try not to be in a situation where they could be put in danger because of the pandemic. So I thought it was actually kind of a good scenario overall.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a consumer, I agree. It really felt fitting. Okay, one question before we get into the real topic, and I let Niels talk a bit. There's only one person why you are here and why I love your campaign so much, and that is Eli. Mm-hmm. And now I want you to tell me about Eli.
Oh, of course. Eli is amazing, and I don't think Mayday Roleplay would exist if it wasn't for Eli. Eli actually came in a little bit late in the game. We had all auditioned originally for Mayday Roleplay. Someone else kind of put it together, and eventually that person left the group. But the point is that Eli came in just to mix our sound, just to do sound effects. But when we were discussing doing the Doomed to Repeat campaign, I said, Eli, why don't you join? Why don't you kind of be a part of this? I know that you play tabletop games. And she said yes, thankfully. And I think she's a wonderful addition as a player. Just does so much work for us that we could never repay her for, but is just a friendly, intelligent, skilled person who I'm just very fortunate to have as a friend.
Yeah, Eli, we love you.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, Niels, please bring me back from my rambling.
Regarding something Sergio already said, today we talk about horror in general. And my first question to you would be, how would you describe or define horror, just to get on the same basis?
That's a very, very good question. Could easily be a very long-winded question. My simple answer is I read a book that kind of discussed the philosophy of horror movies, horror books. And I think that there's basically two kinds of horror. There's the very visceral horror, for example, seeing a dead body, something like that. You have that immediate reaction. But then there's the more lingering horror, the more existential horror, learning some truth that reshapes your vision of reality. That's a kind of horror that sticks around longer. And those are the two kinds that I think kind of best define what most horror is. There's the stuff you react to immediately, and then there's the stuff that lingers with you and haunts you years after.
I mean, especially for me, when I define horror, for example, there's a certain split for especially TTRPGs from other media, which there's for every topic nearly, because TTRPGs just work differently. Because as I always say, you have most of the time you have a DM, GM, handler, storyteller, lore keeper, whatever you want to call it. But they have at least they have their players, and the players are not only there to play protagonists, but are also the co-writers of the game, right? They shape the game with you. You don't have full control. And they are also the audience of what you put on. So if you portray an NPC or portray a monster, they are the ones that react to that. Obviously, podcasters have additional audiences on top of that. So there's probably also a big difference between podcasting and playing a home game for especially horror. And that's a question we would probably ask you in a bit. But TTRPGs work just differently when I think of, for example, horror movies. There are kind of two types of horrors, like you said, that get into your face or that stick with you. But especially with movies, you are not the protagonist of that movie. In games, yes, you are the protagonist, but there's still even more disconnect that there is in TTRPGs. There is still a disconnect, but it's way smaller for TTRPGs than for any other media, which is why I think horror needs to be handled very carefully in TTRPGs especially.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you make a good point that movies are very passive. You're just watching there, and if you're lucky, the tone is so good and the pacing is so good that you kind of get wrapped up in it. But I think that horror games are the way better way of scaring or kind of involving the players. And you make a great point that they have to be just as involved as you are. Like I said earlier, I don't think our game would work if the players were not reacting and not really investing themselves as much as they do. So that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I would recommend a session 0 being extremely important. In our podcast, our session 0 is kind of a game, but we definitely had a session 0 before that where I made it clear what type of game this is, what type of tone it is, what the players should expect, and then maybe most importantly, what the players feel uncomfortable with, which is very important. You want your players to have fun at the end of the day. This is escapism. They want to be scared because it's fun, but they don't want to be traumatized. They don't want to experience something that makes them uncomfortable. So it's important to have that conversation, especially for horror games.
So while in the session 0, you probably use safety tools for TTRPGs in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And how would you say do safety tools relate to horror, and how do you use them to maybe even enhance the horror element, but in a safe way for your players?
That's an interesting question about how do the safety tools enhance it. I think it enhances it because now you know the parameters, right? Like when you're walking into a movie, you know whether it's PG, PG-13, R, X, you know what to expect. And I think when the players know that you know their limitations, then everything else is fair game, and they don't have to be offended when something comes up that they don't want to experience. They can expect everything that's going to be in this game is going to be exactly what they want, and I think they can invest themselves a little bit more. To go to the earlier part of your question, I think you have to talk about what do your players want and what can they expect? I made it very clear to the players that I was going to be kind of brutal. Delta Green is not a system that allows you to have 50 hit points and all these abilities. You're a human. You've got 8 to 10 hit points at best, and it just takes a gunshot or two to kill you. And I also told them I'm going to try to constantly outsmart you in one way or another, to make you feel helpless. That's a big part of horror, is feeling helpless. And so I encourage them to try to outsmart me, try to really plan what you're going to do. You have a team of 6 others, try to outsmart me. And so it created this kind of fun competitiveness between all of us, in trying to outsmart me and me trying to have them fall into my traps, etc. I'm kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent at this point, but I think it's kind of related to all of this session 0 stuff. You just have to be very open with them and what they can expect without spoiling anything.
Yeah. I mean, especially our last episode last week was about expectation management. I think for every game, that's the best thing you can do. Do it often, do it as often as you want, do it right. And especially for horror, it's very needed because, like you said, you don't want your players to feel traumatized, and they want to know what they expect, right? When they want to go to a movie, they can watch trailers or reviews. Video games on Steam always have tags. This is horror. And then what type of horror? Psychological horror, body horror,
right,
or whatever kind of horror. And especially in that, they know what to expect. And I think that's especially what you said, why, for example, that connects to the reactiveness of, for example, the Mayday players, because they know what to expect. They can really just stop worrying about that they might actually get harmed by playing this game and really just get into character and just play it out, because they know there's nothing that will really hurt in either physical or mental or whatever kind of way. And yeah, it gives you the perfect boundaries to work in. You as the DM need to obey them, but you can also probably put in your own.
Yeah.
When I DM and I have a vampire campaign starting up with Niels, for example, in it, I made it very clear that I am not a big fan of body horror. So even if I control when the body horror comes, I just say I don't use it. And that's the boundary that they as players now have to abide. If they want to describe an action, they don't make it too much body horror, right? That's a discussion everyone has inside, right? The DM might be on the other side of the screen, or the handler might be on the other side of the screen, but they are still part of that group that needs to make sure everybody, including them, is safe.
Absolutely. Another reason why Session 0 is so important is sometimes you don't think of all the reasons why. You mentioned body horror, and that's something that I could see someone having issues with. But sometimes there's things you don't think about. For instance, I have players in Mayday Roleplay that are minorities, and they, we have a function within Doom to Repeat where we go back in time sometimes. And, some of the players said to me, Sergio, I'd appreciate if you were conscientious of the fact that there are times in history where minorities are in positions of helplessness or are not in positions of power. And I would appreciate if you didn't portray that a lot, or you didn't really subject us to that. And I thought that was a great point that I really try to follow through with, that I might not have thought of otherwise.
Mm-hmm. The next question we would have for you is basically what types of horrors are there? But I want to twist that question a bit and just ask you, what do you think are the types of horror you use in your Doom to Repeat campaign?
Yeah. Well, I definitely use the kind of immediate visceral imagery horror. Every time a monster walks in a room, every time they find a dead body, they're making sanity checks for that, right? But that's kind of more of a way of defining what is happening to the characters as opposed to the players themselves. Your character is losing sanity from experiencing this, but a player is a little more desensitized to that. That's where the more lingering existential horror comes in to affect the players. In our campaign, I've really tried to, especially in this second arc, I've really tried to integrate the characters' backstories and who they are and their connections with their NPC bonds. I've tried to include that a little bit more, because when that becomes threatened, when that gets in danger, then the players are suddenly, rushing to stop it. Not that they weren't before, but there's a different level of tension when the things they care about are threatened. And that's just good advice for any kind of tabletop game, is, really make sure that the characters feel invested and that their personal backstory is involved somehow in the larger narrative. I use other methods though outside of the table. You can't sustain horror forever. You can't, through a 3 or 4 hour session, however long you play, you can't constantly be trying to scare them. It has to be punctuated. And in the meantime, you can load the rest of the session with tension, paranoia, helplessness, dread, and even levity. And we can talk about that a little bit, how laughing is an important part of, it's like the opposite side of the same coin of horror. I try to then keep the pressure on the players, and that's probably the thing I would recommend the most, is when you're not trying to scare them, keep the pressure on. When the group is making a decision, I don't let them think about it for a long time. I kind of force their hand, because then they have to live with it, and now they're on the edge of their seat of, oh, did we make the right choice? I try to keep a clock going where I can. I warn them that time is moving. Keeping the pressure on them is hard to do, but I think it's one of the most important parts of a horror session, is always making them feel tense, or that they need to get moving, they need to get to the next step, or else.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that while you are not really having them in front of a monster or whatever kind of horror, you need to have them still be pressured for something, but they are not really in danger necessarily, right?
Right.
Again, if I remember correctly from your campaign, there were also enough moments of relative peace for your players, or for the characters, right? They need these kind of downtimey moments where they can basically relax a bit, where they don't have to face immediate danger or necessarily have a lot of pressure, but basically be in the mindset of pressure can be put on us any moment, and that alone gives, I think, okay, on a little bit of a tangent here now. On an episode of Maka and Shep, on a podcasting special I was on a few weeks ago, there was a question how you best work horror into your game. And we talked a little bit about it. Ellie from Dice Drop, the game goddess from this Mutants and Masterminds podcast, said that she uses that she basically asks people in front of every session, and then Tyler from Magic Missile weighed in about something else. I don't remember exactly what, unfortunately. And then the question came to me, and what I said was, the best tool I have for horror in my games is a little bit of the imagination of my players. I don't know if you would agree, but for me this is, if I describe something to them, I always take the first Alien movie as an example. You don't see the monster until basically like the last 20 minutes of the movie. You don't see it. You only see maybe the tail. You see acid spit or something. Right. You see signs of carnage where it tear down some air vents or something. But there's never really the monster seen. And as a viewer of that movie, you imagine the monster in your head, you imagine the alien in your head, and then when it comes, you still are surprised, but the suspense you made yourself, because there was never really any suspense actually in the movie made,
right,
except for the imagery shown and for the sounds made. That was enough to scare you, and your own imagination did that to you. And that's one of the biggest tools, for example, that I use.
Yeah, I really enjoy explaining the carnage or the wake a monster leaves behind, rather than explaining or describing the monster itself, and let the vision or the picture form in the players' minds themselves. It makes it feel a little more immersive for the players, I think, or I hope so at least. So they have this exact picture in mind without me describing or forcing a picture on them. With just the actions the monster takes, they form themselves a picture of what they think the monster looks like.
Yeah, I think you're both hitting on probably a very important rule of horror, which is, tell, don't show until, the climactic moment when they do face it or whatever. Because you're right, the player's imagination is way better than anything you could ever describe. And many times I've ended up showing an image of what the monster's supposed to look like or whatever, and it doesn't always live up to the expectations of the players. So you're right, you have to rely on their imagination. What I was going to say is that sometimes sometimes as a handler, as a DM or whatever, there is this problem where you know what is good. When you watch a movie 9 times out of 10, you can tell, okay, this is a good movie for whatever reason, even if you're not able to describe it. It has good pacing, the acting is good, the effects are good, whatever, but it's hard to replicate it yourself in your game. And it takes time, it takes practice, and it takes listening to your players. And like you said, sometimes you will run a horror session and find out that the scariest thing, or the thing that the players were most scared about, you really didn't think about. You spent no time planning or prepping, but this one element really horrified them. And that's where you start to learn after practicing and after running sessions that sometimes it's the little things that can scare players. And like you both have described, sometimes just your description of it is all that is needed to scare them. And to add to that, a little trick I learned is that, especially when you are running a Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green, where it's kind of Lovecraftian, sometimes it's fun when they do come across the monster to describe it in impossible ways. For instance, let's say it's some kind of demonic hound or something. You don't describe it as a dog. You describe it as a mangled, bloody, gnarling, gnashing a creature that has 4 legs, but sometimes a 5th leg comes out, and you just describe the impossible. So the players are constantly trying to formulate it in their heads and have a hard time doing it. And I think that adds to the horror when you can't perfectly describe something, because if it's just a dog, it's just a dog. But if it's a hellhound with all of these crazy attributes, suddenly it's a little bit more.
Yep, I believe especially when you get into describing the impossible for your players, the first thought that comes to mind is this isn't possible. But right when I describe a dragon, who in my D&D games isn't necessarily all that scary to my players, I can still describe it as a dragon, and that's also not possible. But especially now coming a little bit back to especially your game and Delta Green, they are playing actual humans in more or less our actual outside world. If I look outside my window, the agents could walk around this.
Right.
And then describing the impossible while they are portraying that role of that agent in the real world. Yeah, I think the immersion the players have is, for horror especially, immersion is, in my opinion, very important. Getting your players into the role and them really feeling that role. So yeah, getting them comfortable with their character probably is also very important, because then they actually know how to react. Because often enough, when you are faced with a very horrifying thing, there needs to be a gut reaction. What do you do, right? The first thing you do. And your agents and also researchers, because you, in the first episode, in episode session 0, you had the 2 types of player characters, right? That alone already made me think that there are different types of reactions probably when they face down something that is not possible.
Sure, a federal agent who is trained with weapons and negotiating tactics, they're going to handle a situation a little differently than somebody who's a scholar or, just kind of reading books and stuff.
And I think especially in that case, knowing what your players would do, how they would react to that thing that you describe, that is a very crucial point for horror, or for that type of horror, because, like you said, helplessness. Now make that reaction useless, or not, but basically make it feel useless. I shoot it with my gun. Yeah, well, it doesn't really care about your gun.
Right.
And then fuck.
Yeah, now what do we do?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very important, and it's important as a handler or as a DM to understand that D&D is a power fantasy. You become incredibly powerful, you save the day. The fun of Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, and those kinds of horror games, probably to a certain extent Vampire, is that you're just not, it's not a hero fantasy. The fun is more in the narrative and in Call of Cthulhu, best case scenario, you kind of figure out what's going on, but you end up going insane or dying in the process. So as a player, you come to the game with a different set of goals, a different way of having fun. You want to tell a story, you want to be scared, and you want to get as close as possible to the truth, knowing that it's probably going to end your life or drive you crazy,
Yeah, I mean, that's the player buy-in, right?
Right.
When you sign up for such a game, that's something you more or less expect or get told in session 0, hopefully, that you are actually managed, that you can buy into that horror, that you can say, okay, yeah, this is fine. For example, I'm in a campaign that's now running 8 years.
Wow.
And yeah, I'm playing that since 8 years. That's that's still my first campaign ever. We have grown very fond of these characters. I mean, I'm 22. That character was created when I was 14 years old.
Wow.
Like, I've grown with that character, right? That I have a certain attachment to that character, and it's a character in such a hero fantasy. Very powerful, the best in their field, in their ranger right there. They are very good at nature, and now having them basically die or go insane while playing this obviously would be okay, but it still would make me. I don't even know how to describe it really.
It would suck. It would suck.
It would,
I mean,
it would suck.
You put a lot of time and energy into this character. I get that, and that was an interesting challenge for me because I told the cast I wanted a kind of a longer running campaign. We're going into our second arc, and a challenge for me was I'm running a system where characters regularly die. How do you deal with that? And the way I deal with it is kind of in the structure of our campaign, where the players play researchers and folks who are doing more reading than they are killing monsters. And so that's kind of the way I justify how they're able to linger around longer. But this second arc, things happen that are pretty bad.
I'm already excited.
Yeah. But the point is that it's a little harder in horror to have these kind of longer running stories because characters do get axed a lot.
Let's say we are creating a horror plot for our own game. What are some things we need to be on the lookout for when we are creating our own horror plot, our own horror campaign, or just an arc in our own homebrew game? Do you have any tips for that?
That's a great question. Well, I recently created an original scenario for Delta Green that I released, and we ran a one-shot the other day on Twitch. And what I learned from that experience was you kind of have to take all that you have learned about the way narrative works, whether it be movies or books or any way that you consume stories, and try to apply it as effectively as you can to when you're creating a game. Meaning, we were talking earlier about kind of changing the pace and the tone. You can't always be trying to scare them, but it also can't be a laugh fest where they're just always making jokes. You really have to try to control what they learn, when they learn it, and kind of how things unfold. I would recommend, if you're creating a horror campaign, really get to know the characters. Take your time talking with the players about who these characters are and how to integrate them into the larger narrative. There's nothing worse than when I work on a character for a game and I sit down at the table and many sessions pass. The game has nothing to do with my character. I could disappear and the narrative and it wouldn't matter. Integrating them makes them care about it more, and that's a good start. And then knowing when to punctuate with horror, dropping a dead body here, having them learn about a situation that is impossible or very strange, and just always mounting that tension. It's really effective. At least I have found that even in quiet moments, there should always be some kind of thread of, okay, we've got to move on or else we're going to get caught, or we need to solve this problem before midnight or else something bad is going to happen. Really take your time when you're planning it, of not letting there be too much leeway. The players have to keep moving. I think it's important for horror that there be this constant moving of the narrative, moving it forward and learning new things, growing, reacting. So when you lay out your game, look at the structure and try to find the points that, okay, maybe I could tighten this, or maybe I could add a little bit of tension here, or maybe I could make this NPC a little more weird so that the players become a little more paranoid of that NPC. It's just constantly, finding ways of making that horror always present, even if it's just in the background. As opposed to with like a fantasy game, you can just kind of plan it out. You know where you want dungeons to be, you know where you want traps to be. There's a lot of similarities, but it's a little bit more of a focus on tone, I think, when you're planning horror.
I just had a question, a weird question, I would say. Is there something you would say that could be described as horror creep? Horror creep?
Horror creep. And do you mean by that the horror is creeping in? Is that what you mean?
that's the thing. The word power creep, right?
I see.
When the threat always escalates,
Right.
escalates, because if you throw a hellhound at your players 2-3 times in a row, at some point that thing becomes not necessarily manageable from a stat point, right? We still need to run away, but it becomes manageable in the horror sense.
Sure.
We've known this. This is not scary anymore. And is that something one really has to worry about, and how to deal with that?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on that you can only throw a hellhound or a zombie or whatever at these, at your players so many times before, it just becomes kind of passé or boring. And that's always kind of a pet peeve of mine as a player, is when a DM is not kind of changing things up and trying new things, throwing new things at us. I think, horror creep probably does exist, where the players will become desensitized. If they're going to return to a similar situation or a familiar enemy, you're right that there needs to be a new twist on it. Some new complication needs to arise that puts it in a new framework, just kind of puts it in a new perspective maybe that they hadn't seen before. And actually it reminds me that, sometimes it's one thing to see a zombie, and it's another thing when the next time you see that zombie, you learn something new about it. Like, for instance, a monster is scary, but it's so much scarier to me when a monster is almost in pain itself. Like, if the monster doesn't want to be there just as much as the players don't want to be there, that's a kind of horror that's really off-putting, when you realize the monster is just as tortured as the players might be. And that might be something the players might not realize until the second time they encounter it. It's gnashing and pulling at its own flesh. That's something that you might not pick up on the first time, and it adds a new layer of complexity to that horror.
Mm-hmm. One more question from me, at least, is you in the beginning talked about, I think, I don't know the word anymore, but it was basically having these moments of still comedy or laughter in the game.
Yeah.
How do you work with those?
Well, you can't fight them sometimes. That's important. Sometimes I think DMs, stop what's going on, and it's okay sometimes if the players get out of hand to state, okay, guys, we're getting a little silly here. But the reason levity is important is because I think the players will become exhausted if you're just nothing but throwing horror and existential dread at them. There needs to be that moment where they can release. They make a joke about the situation. In the first arc of Doomed to Repeat, the first maybe 3 sessions are extremely intense, and then there's a very silly moment that breaks the tension. And I think the players as characters ended up bonding over that very kind of silly moment. It was a moment for them all to kind of relax. And I think it makes it that much more effective when the horror return. The players have bonded, their heart rate has gone down, and then things start ramping back up again. So it's like changing the gears of a car. You can't live in one gear the entire time. You have to shift gears because it just helps the overall performance. So I would include it. I purposefully included that moment of levity. It wouldn't have happened had I not slotted it in, but I knew that it was going to help the players relax and possibly even form connections between their characters.
And I think having these relaxation moments just amplifies the next peak of the horror even further.
100%.
It just escalates the curve, basically.
Yeah.
So one question I still have for you is we talked a lot about what can you do to achieve the horrors and stuff, but how do you actually keep the pressure on your players? What do you do in-game reason-wise? How do you achieve the small little details that make up the whole horror themes?
Right. As a handler or as a DM, you have to be paying attention. It requires taking notes. It requires thinking about your players' actions. I, as a handler, really enjoy figuring out what happens next because of the players' actions. Often, I will run a session that I don't really have a ton of notes for. I just kind of have a plan for it. I'm running that session, though, to see what the players do, and then I react to that in the next session. I take copious notes. I think about it the whole week, and then I plan and do the reaction. And in that reaction, I plan for things like adding tension, adding pressure, little things like, sure, you can shoot that monster, but now everyone in the neighborhood is going to hear that gunshot and people are going to start coming, asking questions. And now you've got to deal with all these bystanders. You might have to deal with the cops. when they are making decisions, let's say a monster walks out of a room or something horrible is happening, I don't allow the players to sit there and think about it for very long. I tell them, guys, right now, tell me what you're going to do, or else this monster's going to tear your throat out. I put the pressure on them to make decisions. And I think for players, that's the most tense thing, is making a decision on the fly when you're not 100% sure about that decision. So really finding ways of making the players react when they aren't ready to react, I think is where the tension for players comes from. Other ways, what I do in this Delta Green campaign is I often show behind the scenes. At the end of an episode, I'll usually have a little stinger, a little 1 or 2 minute stinger that shows what is happening that the players are unaware of. And it has an interesting effect. I could see it being a little bit hard maybe to bring this into a normal home game, but maybe you could do it where when you are recap, for instance, you could maybe do a recap and explain something that occurs that the players aren't aware of, just to make them aware that the world is reacting, things are constantly changing, and if they don't move, they could get steamrolled. Those are some ways. I'm sure I'm not thinking of other ways, but like I said, punctuating the session with little bits of horror. And I think what Emil said, finding what your players are actually scared of and what they are reacting to is very important too. The next session, you got to make sure that you push those buttons. So pay attention to what your players are reacting to, for sure.
Mm-hmm. One last question before we wrap up this whole discussion. Since you are a GM or handler for a podcast, there's probably a little bit of a difference than running a home game. You probably have to take care of an audience as well.
Sure.
How do you do that? How can you, what advice would you give to especially DMs or handlers or lore keepers that want to run for a real audience next to their players?
Right. That's a good question. And yeah, not a lot of folks really have to worry about that. It does add a level of complexity, but my barometer is always making sure that the players are having fun. If the players are enjoying themselves, there's a very good chance the audience will enjoy themselves. One, because they're probably just reacting to the players, and two, because it means you've got something there that most people at a table would probably enjoy anyway. When it comes to the audience, we try to do a little bit extra. Our sound design is very important to us. Eli does an incredible job with that, with sound effects and music. As you discussed with Eli, music at a table, sound design at a table can really add to the ambience. And it's the same with audiences. They react to that. And then little things, like I mentioned, the stingers at the end, the little kind of moments without the players. I think the audience has really reacted positively to that, because the audience knows something that the players in that moment don't know. And that's something that Alfred Hitchcock did a lot, is that he would, the audience would know that there's a bomb under the table. The characters wouldn't know. And suddenly there's all this tension that mostly the audience is feeling, not the characters themselves. They don't know there's a bomb. So doing that kind of stuff, I think, helps bring the audience in on the fun. And just, thinking about what are the things about horror movies and horror content that you like, and how can you bring it in? The theme, the way we introduce the show, the music we choose, pretty much every trapping of the show is in some way thinking about the audience and how to include them and how they might react to it. Because the game is really just for the players, and everything else is for the audience.
I mean, especially for me, for example, I was in a stream game of Call of Cthulhu once, and what our DM did on his channel was, before we start the game and after the break, put a disclaimer. Call of Cthulhu deals with these kinds of topics. The players have been briefed before the session and before the campaign, right? This is important, right? The audience needs to it's like going into a movie, right? The audience is there to entertain themselves, so they should also be the ones that get to know what kind of themes the campaign deals, just as the players do. I remember that you guys have a disclaimer right up front.
That's right.
To repeat, it's a Delta Green actual play podcast dealing with violent themes and adult language, COVID-19, and all of that stuff, because some people should be informed that this is part of the game. And that's my opinion as a consumer. The best thing a podcast can do is tell me up front what the themes of the episode or the show are that I want to watch or listen to, because then I can get into it. Then I can actually enjoy it. Because if someone only says, this is very hard horror, and I'm like, okay, but is it the kind of horror I enjoy or not? And I watch it, and then it's the kind I not enjoy. That feels bad for me.
Yeah, you make a great point that it's very important to let the audience in on what is happening here with disclaimers and with other things, with the art that you might produce, or the pretty much everything should be telegraphing to the audience what to expect. But you're right, those disclaimers are very important. And for those who are not triggered by things such whether it be violence or whatever, sometimes it's fun to know, okay, all right, I can expect something crazy in this episode because there's a very long disclaimer coming up, you know, which we will have for Arc 2. There's a lot of disclaimers.
You're making me more excited.
So we are nearing the end of the episode, and I would like one of you guys to just quickly brush over the things we talked about to summarize everything.
Oh, Sergio, please go ahead.
Oh man, we talked about a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
I think the main takeaway is that horror is definitely more challenging than other kinds of narrative, but it's not impossible to do it. It's just a matter of setting the tone, making sure that the players understand what they're walking into, making sure that they're excited for it, and running the session like if you're playing music. You don't want to just constantly be hitting the horror notes. You want to hit the tension notes, and you want to hit the levity, and you want to hit the feelings of strangeness and confusion, and you really have to kind of pepper in all of these different elements to make a horror game or a horror session fully effective. And you have to communicate. You know, horror is escapism, and it's not good to throw things at people that they're not expecting or that they don't want to experience. So player buy-in is super important. And it's just important to also look at other media that is creating horror and steal from it. It's okay to mimic things, because if it works, and it's going to work for everyone, or most of the time it will, at least. So don't be afraid to steal. Don't be afraid to be inspired by horror, and really kind of figure out for yourself what you find horrifying and try to bring it to the table. And I think the players will enjoy it.
Then, Sergio, please tell us and tell the people where they can find you. Shout out any person, any people, anything really you want. You have the floor to you.
Well, first I want to thank you guys. This is a great show. I've been listening to you guys probably since Eli came on. You know, that's what attracted me to it, and I've been listening to it since. You guys are very, very good, and I really like all the wisdom that you give out on this show. So thank you for doing this show. I am the DM for Doomed to Repeat. We are releasing our second campaign, or our second arc for the Doomed to Repeat campaign, the 29th of October, which is like 2 days before Halloween. So that'll be out. If you're listening to this now, go to our podcast channel, wherever you get your podcasts, and listen to it. The first episode will be out, but there's also the first arc. If you haven't listened to the first arc, listen to that. We have a Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Mayday Roleplay. We play games like Starforged. We play games, one-shots. We currently have an Orpheus campaign, which is kind of in the vein of Delta Green. It's more focused on ghosts and has a little bit of a lighter tone. It's not as kind of dreadful. It's a weird word to say, but it's not as intense as Delta Green. But it's kind of in the same vein, and it's fun. We've just started that. You can catch up on the 2 episodes of that. And we also have our D&D campaign, Ashoka. It's been great to, you know, change gears and do D&D as opposed to just horror stuff, and it's been great to see the reaction. Folks like you and other folks online have really reacted positively to our D&D campaigns. We're very happy about that. So whatever flavor of game you want to listen to, we probably are doing it in some way. So check us out.
All right. So you can find us on Twitter at DoubleDMPod. Also, the same handle goes for Instagram. You can check out our website at www.doubledm.com. And yeah, thanks, Sergio, for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, guys.
And hear you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.